Christian, we may think at times that one of the blessings would be no trials, but that's not true. The blessing is that there is a purpose in the trial. Now imagine a lost person and things are happening in her life. It seems to be just random without purpose. That is not true for the Christian. Nothing happens in your life without purpose, and that includes trials. So, but there's not just one type of trial. There's various types of trials. There's different kinds of trials. And so we're just going to review real quickly what we covered last week, and then we'll try to finish up here this evening. So one of the purposes in trials, we looked at 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 7 through 10, and this is where the Apostle Paul, he had what he called a thorn in the flesh, and he was asking God to remove this thorn. But he would find out that there was a purpose in this trial, that he would come to be grateful for the trial. And so in verse 7, he says, "Lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelation, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." You know one thing trials does? They keep us humble, okay? And how many of you have been kind of doing, just kind of coasting, or maybe even really doing really well, and man, you get hit with a trial? What does that do? It should cause us to run back to Christ and dependence upon Him, and it causes us to realize how much we need Him. And in this context, it's written in context of serving God in ministry, which our lives should be about that. Our lives should be ministry, okay? That's what we're here as His representatives in this world. And so they help us to remain fruitful. And because apart from Christ, we can do nothing. And so when we become self-sufficient, we lose God's power and we become proud. And when we're proud, we are not as fruitful as God would want us to be. Billy Graham used to have critics all over the place, okay? And God used him tremendously. And he took that criticism to keep him humble. And that's the way he approached it. And God used him in a tremendous way. Charles Spurgeon said this about he openly spoke about his struggles with depression, and he acknowledged that it was a great source of pain in his life, this depression that he continually dealt with throughout his life. But he recognized that depression kept him dependent upon God's grace. It reminded him of his own weakness, okay? So sometimes we got these thorns, okay, that maybe that they're not going to go away, but they're not necessarily bad. They're bad from our perspective, but God uses those things to keep us dependent upon Him. And you know what? God can do more with a Christian that realizes his weakness than someone that's relying on their own abilities and their own skills, their own talents. We see that often. And I use the example of Chuck Colson. It wasn't a physical ailment that he dealt with, but he was one of the men that got in trouble during the Nixon administration for the Watergate scandal, and he ended up getting convicted over that, but he was converted before he went to jail, but that was a constant reminder for him, but he didn't let that just beat him down and into self-pity, like, oh, look at what I did. No, it kept him humble, so God used him because that reminder of his past failure. So don't let past failure keep you from serving Him. Instead, run to God and say, Lord, you know this is in my past, and humbly rely upon Him and let Him figure out how He's going to use you. And so it's also an opportunity for God's power and glory to be revealed when we go through any trial. You know, not all suffering, and I mentioned this last week very adamantly, not all suffering is a result of your sin. Don't ever look at someone else that's suffering and go, oh, I wonder what they did. Boy, God's getting them. And and think that just because someone's suffering, it's a result of something they've done. You know, we saw that in John chapter 9 when Jesus was passing by and he saw a man which was blind from his birth, and his own disciples said this, "Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, said, "Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him." So God would take that situation and he would use it to demonstrate his power and bring glory to himself. And God has used many people at many different times. Remember last week I mentioned a man named Vujicic, I think is how you say his name. He was born with the tetraamelia syndrome, which is, he was born, he didn't have arms or legs. No arms or no legs. Could you imagine that? Is there anybody more helpless than someone that has no arms and no legs? And he's born that way. So as a child, he really struggled with that. And you can imagine. I mean, we all would, right? And he felt isolated, rejected, and he felt in despair. He questioned why he was different from other kids and why God would allow him to be born with such a disability. And he described how he had intense anger about it and frustration. He felt like his life was completely meaningless. What can I possibly do, in this condition? He wrestled with the why questions that many faced with, and he wondered why God didn't give him a normal body. So he writes about and talks about being honest about that struggle. But then, through his relationship with Christ, his salvation, he began to find answers and purpose. He came to believe that God truly did have a plan for his life. He didn't fully understand it. He says that. But he found comfort and strength in God's Word. And then began to have a totally different perspective. He came to the understanding that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. So now he understands that his life has a purpose, and that purpose is to glorify God. By the way, that's the same for all of us. And if we're going to glorify God, it will be when we rely upon his strength. So he sees now that his limited physical abilities do not limit what God can do with us. The only thing that limits us being used by God is our own pride. A man with no arms and no legs has been a great servant of God. So now he sees his life as a testament to God's power. He goes around and he speaks to people and talks to people and shares his testimony with people, and he has no arms and he has no legs. And folks, too many times we rely upon our own power, our own strength, our own abilities, and we get exactly what that produces. Not much, okay? He had a great blessing, if we looked at it rightly, to realize he had no choice but to rely upon God. The reality is we don't either, okay? I suppose we have a choice to try to do it ourselves, but it doesn't work. The quicker we realize that we need to abide in Christ, and apart from him we can do nothing, God can use us. And on the flip side, whatever thorn in the flesh you might have, that does not limit God using you whatsoever at all. Period. Okay? You could be blind, deaf, no arms, no legs, and God could still use you. You say, how? Well, he's God and we're not. Okay? So that's where we left off, is understanding that those things. But then there's a third purpose for trials in the believer's life. Now turn over to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. So one is to keep us humble and fruitful and useful. Secondly, as an opportunity for God's power and glory to be revealed. And third, this is the one we don't like. This is for instruction. Sometimes we are suffering because of stuff we've done, okay? So, and we've all been there, okay? We've all been out to the proverbial woodshed, and but I want you to understand, though, this is not punishment, okay, the way we think of it. It is chastisement. So look at verse 6. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. Chasteneth, pray tell, okay, just based on that portion, the first half of that verse, it says, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. What can we derive from just that portion of it? It's teaching, but what does it tell us about God and our relationship with him, just based on that first half of it? Who the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. Yeah. In other words, he chastens out of love, but he does it because he loves us. If you don't experience it, that's not good news, okay? That's the point. He chastens his children. He's training up his children. If you can go on and sin and it doesn't bother you and it doesn't affect you, and I've told people this before. If your pastor stops calling you and pestering you when you're not at church, okay, and that's bad news. You ought to think it's good news when people are reaching out to you and say, hey, we miss you. Hey, we miss you. I think in part that's God's way of reaching out to you, okay? God has said, I've heard this said before, that God whispers to us through his word, but he shouts at us through our trials. Sometimes it's a way of God's getting our attention, say, you're going the wrong way. And that's good, though. It's good. So, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. And if he endure chastening, God deal with you as with sons, for what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if you be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are you bastards and not sons. You know, growing up in my dad's home, never one time did I see him discipline my friends or my neighbor's kids, or the neighbor's kids. He did me, though. Why do you suppose that was? They weren't his kids, all right? God disciplines and chastises his children. And that goes on in verse 9. Furthermore, we had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we have gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and lives? So it chastens his instructions, as Linda said. It's instructing us through discipline. All right. Now, we don't like it. No one likes discipline. Okay. If you didn't like it when you were a kid, and you know what? I'm almost 50 years old. I still don't like it, but it is still good for us, though, and it's still good that we experience it. But notice that he does so out of love and not anger. Proverbs 3:11, my son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, neither be weary of his correction. For whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth, even as a father the son in whom he delighteth. So chastening is good because we need it. And so understand that God's purpose in disciplining or chastening his children is to instruct and teach us. Now, if you're like me, sometimes you're a slow learner, okay? And sometimes you go back for a couple, 2 or 3 more spankings before you get the lesson. You know, we're best to get it the first time, you know, or even better yet, just trust what God's word says about it so you don't have to experience it. But nonetheless, God does do that in our lives, okay? And it's a good thing to do that. Now, if we have the wrong perspective and you just view it in horizontally, and you may not like it in this life, okay? But he's preparing us for eternity. He's preparing us for usefulness. He's preparing us for, he's got a much better, bigger plan for you than our limited way of thinking. So don't reject his chastening. Don't think that this is a big mistake. Don't think that he's against you. Don't think that he's against you, because if you experience God's chastening. And then next, reason why we suffer trials is simply for the same reason that Christ suffered. It's because this world's against Christ and his followers. Just simply put, you can endure trials just simply because of living in this evil world that's against Christ and his followers. The world hates Jesus. And he told us the world would hate us as well. And the more you look like Christ, let me put it this way. You should be surprised if you're skating through this life as a follower of Christ and not enduring some sort of trials. That should be the odd thing. Do you believe that? Okay. That's the odd thing. Because then you're looking more like the world. We really should be going against the grain. And so I know a few times experiencing some things that might just kind of sort of look like persecution. But boy, if we're not experiencing some trials, and just because we're followers of Christ, something's wrong. Something's wrong. I don't get discouraged. Like we dealt with a couple of things where I remember the food bank with how some of you know about that and how we dealt with that. That didn't discourage me whatsoever that they were upset. I don't know how upset they were, but it didn't matter if they did. Because you know what? I don't go out trying to ruffle feathers. The gospel will do that itself, you know. But if you venture away from the gospel, you're not going to ruffle any feathers. And so I think too many times we're afraid to ruffle feathers. And so, and by the way, sometimes that comes from other Christians that are rejecting the gospel in its entirety, all right? So too many times we don't see this kind of trials because we're not resembling the Christ of the Bible. But we should expect trials and suffering if we're living for Christ. 1 Peter 4:12, Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. Look at verse 13. But rejoice inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, you may be glad also with exceeding joy. If you be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. And on their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. So, now this would be none of us are looking for trials for doing right. But we should expect them. And then when you do experience some suffering, what is the proper response that we just read? If you experience suffering simply because you're doing right for Christ in his name, what is the proper response? Joy. Why? You get to share in his sufferings. You get to impart, you get more of the experience. By the way, you would never, let me think of it this way. You will never experience that type of suffering unless you're really close to Christ and walking with him. And guess what? That's the bonus. That's the good. The closeness with Christ, and you're suffering with him. By the way, you're not doing it alone. Okay? It means you're following Christ closely. Okay? And that's a good thing. So rejoice, because that says something. And so I don't want to keep going down that, but so realize that it is better to suffer for righteousness' sake, suffer for the name of Christ, than it is for unrighteousness, because verse 15 he tells us, but let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, as a busybody in other men's matters. Too many times in my own life, I've been suffering discipline or suffering chastisement, and not for walking with Christ. Okay, so lastly we're going to cover, how do we respond? Okay, how do we respond to trials? I've touched on some of these things, but the rest of the time we're going to spend. Okay, there's multiple different types of trials, but Generally speaking, how should we respond? Well, first know that the most common response to trials is this: to seek deliverance. That's the most common thing. Most right away when we go, that's our number one priority. Get out of this difficulty. And that becomes, most of the time, that becomes our complete focus. We just want to get out of it. We want the suffering over with. We want the trial over with. But we got to know this, that God is always seeking for us to develop greater dependence or faith, whether deliverance happens or not. The Apostle Paul, he asked, there's nothing wrong with seeking deliverance and asking, okay, and praying. Apostle Paul asked 3 times for the thorn to be removed. But don't miss out on God's grace for the trial, because you simply are completely focused on getting out of it. Sometimes God says, my grace is sufficient for thee, and he will give you the grace to get through the trial. And it might be a thorn that stays with you the rest of your life. But I promise you this, if you practice dependence upon him, he will give you the grace to endure any trial, even if it's for the rest of your life. But if for the rest of your life you're constantly seeking for that thorn to get removed, if it is a thorn that you're dealing with, that's a recipe for misery for the rest of your life. Doesn't mean you don't seek, if it's a medical issue, seek those kinds of things. But in the meantime, trust God and his grace to give you the strength to endure through it. Don't reject that. Don't fight against it. Secondly, know that our lack of trust in God's character can cause us to fight against his perfect will for our lives. When we go through trials, it's called a trial because it's a what? Test of our faith. Well, what's the test of our faith? Testing what we believe about God and his character. That's what it is. When we're talking about God's sovereignty, the only reason why, I don't want to assume that you know what I mean by God's sovereignty. When we're talking about God's sovereignty, we're talking about him being the supreme ruler. Okay? Nothing happens in this world that doesn't go up across his desk, so to speak. You know, President Trump sits at the Resolute desk, and that's kind of it's where things get decided. Nothing happens in this world that doesn't go across the Resolute desk of our God. Now you say, okay, I believe God's in control. We say it all the time. So why do we struggle with trials? It's the other part. It's not the sovereignty part. It's knowing his character and knowing his purposes. That's the part we struggle with. So if we're tempted to blame God or get upset or we're frustrated and angry, the problem is our trust in who our God is. And you'll get tested with that when you go through a trial. Do you believe God's got a purpose in your trial, and do you believe it's good? Now, that's genuine faith. So don't just learn to cope with it, okay? Some will turn to drugs, alcohol, and all kinds of things just to cope with their trial, just all kinds of things, to maybe just all sorts of distractions in life, just trying to cope through life. Do you believe this? You could be the most useful and prosperous and the most joyful Christian because of your trial. Because of it. Because you might actually live a life fully dependent upon him that you wouldn't have done otherwise. You might gain something much better than you had before. And that's a deeper relationship with Christ. That is a blessing in light of eternity. But too many times we're either seeking to get out of it or just to cope with it. Don't seek a way to just learn to accept it. Okay, that kind of sounds good. You just need to accept it. No, I think it's more than that. You need to believe this, that God always has a good purpose in our trials. Always. For his children. Do you believe that, though? You need to believe that and learn to rejoice in what He is doing or going to do. That is knowing your God. Okay? That is knowing your God. Now you say, I'm not there. Well, guess what? We're all kind of on a spectrum, and none of us are all the way there, completely trusting Him 100%. Okay? Why do we encourage one another? Because we do have an enemy that comes and want to tell you and blaspheme the name of God and say, you know what? He's not good. He doesn't have a good purpose in this. Third, know that when we are suffering for doing what is right, we must commit our care to God. Okay, you can say, you know what? I can't really identify like this is not chastisement. I really don't see that I'm really been rebellious. I've confessed and I've dealt with that. Really, and you can really, you've been out there and you've been really serving God and you've been witnessing, or maybe you're a teacher, or maybe you're serving God in some capacity in the church, and you've been out handing tracts out, and you say, you know what? That you can really figure out this is because I've been serving God. And I'm suffering because I'm proclaiming the name of Christ and people are coming after me. You need to commit your care to God. Let me explain. If you're 1 Peter chapter 4, again, in verse 19. Wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to Him in well-doing, as unto a faithful Creator. That phrase, commit the keeping of their souls, means this, essentially. The physical can be destroyed, but not the inner man, unless we allow it. All sorts of things can happen to us in this life, physically. But no man can touch the inner man. No man can affect the inner man. No man can affect the spiritual part of you except what you allow to happen. No matter what happens to you, you cannot be affected there except for how you respond to what's going on. That's the point. But to do that, you've got to commit that to Christ. Turn over to, I'll just read this, 2 Timothy 1:12. Paul's speaking here, he's talking about the gospel, for suffering for the gospel. For which cause I also suffer these things, nevertheless I am not ashamed. So the Apostle Paul suffered greatly for the gospel ministry. But he said this, for I know whom I have believed. There it is. And am persuaded that He is able to keep that which I have committed unto Him against that day. So, what we got to do is surrender or relinquish control. Realize we can't control the circumstances. Trust and believe that God is faithful in caring for us. And demonstrate dependence, realizing that it is His battle to fight and not ours. So when you serve God and you're doing right, proclaiming the gospel, could be preaching, could be whatever it is, realize it's His battle to fight, not yours. That's committing your soul to Him and trusting Him. And by the way, this is exactly what Jesus did when He was on the cross. Luke 23:46, and when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, He said, Father, into Thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, He gave up the ghost. So, let's see how much more we got here. We've got two more. Fourth, know that we should be more concerned about guarding what will last for all eternity. Too many times we're worried about guarding our bank accounts, our physical health. Not saying we shouldn't do that, shouldn't plan, shouldn't show concern for those and do all of that. But we need to guard our hearts. We need to guard our hearts. There's a part of us that cannot be destroyed by what happens to us. Are you thankful for that? There's a part of you no matter what. Now, as we age, the more and more I'm thankful for that. Okay. But that part of us is only impacted, get this, by how you respond to your trial. You do have a choice in that. You cannot be put out of commission in serving God by what happens to you, but you can by how you respond to what happens to you. The Apostle Paul was used even when he was shipwrecked, even when he was placed in prison, even when he was beaten. A man with no arms and no legs was used because he refused to respond wrong, but he responded by trusting God. So it is the heart we should be most concerned about when we go through a trial, and guard it. That, the longer I've been saved and the longer I go through trials, that is one of the first thoughts I have when something happens, is I better start thinking right. That's what I'm talking about guarding. That's how you guard your heart. You got to start thinking truth. You got to start claiming the promises of God. You got to start focusing on that, especially when those whammies hit you really hard you didn't expect and it's hard. You really need to consume yourself with truth, which might be, I'll give you a little hint. Call up someone you trust that gets their counsel from God, because you might need a little help doing that. And that doesn't mean that, oh, I'm a weak Christian because I do that. It means you're a wise one. Okay? Call up other Christians when you get hit with that. Say, you know what? I need help thinking about this right. I'm not sure that someone did this, someone did that, this happened. I'm not sure how I can think about this properly. And a good Christian will steer you to the Word of God and help you to see it properly, so you know the next step that you should take. But that's part of guarding your heart. That's why it's good to surround yourself. That's why we have a church body, in part, is that we have people to surround us with, to help us with that. Proverbs 4:23, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Right there it is. If you respond wrong, you let bitterness come in, you let anger come in and all that. It don't matter if you got $10 million in the bank. If you're full of bitterness and anger, you're going to be miserable, and you're not going to be useful to God. Matthew 10:28, and fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul. Rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. You know, that last part of it is speaking to God's care, which is the last point, to respond properly. I want you to hear this. Know that God takes care of those things most valuable to Him. Do you believe you're valuable to God? If you don't, let me prove it that you are. He gave His best to buy you. His most prized possession, if you could say, His Son. He gave and His shed blood to buy you. That's how valuable you are to Him. Do you not think He's going to take care of you? That's what He's saying. Let me read those verses again. And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear Him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. That ought to give you tremendous comfort when you go through a trial, particularly when it's for doing right, or even if it's not for doing right. Trust that God cares for those things that are most valuable to Him. Okay? Don't we all do that? We all do that. I mean, if you go and buy a brand new car and maybe it's a really just a collector's edition type car, you're going to take care of that thing, right? I mean, you'll park it in the garage and you park your wife's car out in the driveway. You know what? I try to take good care of my wife. Why? Extremely valuable to me. Think about how much more valuable we are to God. He will take care of us through our trials. Okay? All right, we're going to take time for prayer requests, and then we'll spend a moment in prayer. Pray for this missionary that had his wheel fall off his camper, and pray for him.